Let's face it, MMA fighters have a terrible track record in boxing. They may be elite in the mixed martial arts world, but boxing is a completely different sport entirely. Yet the second someone becomes UFC champion, they're calling out Canelo Alvarez, Jake Paul, or any other famous boxer. But if there's so much evidence that MMA fighters will fail, why are they so keen to step into boxing? And why does it always end in disaster? The most obvious reason is just the fact they're not the same sport. Sure, there's boxing and MMA, but it's just one piece of an incredibly complex puzzle.
What Ultimate Fighting is, it's the actual sport of fighting. It encompasses all aspects of fighting: ground game, kicking, punching, elbows, submissions, all the above. That's why it's much more exciting. That's why it's a much more dynamic sport. What boxing is one aspect of mixed martial arts.
And when you think about it, boxing in MMA isn't even the same as actual boxing. The distance is different, the stances aren't the same, and the gloves make a huge impact. Because of all the techniques and things to worry about in MMA, you very rarely get a fight that looks anything remotely similar to a boxing match. Whereas for boxers, they can stand toe-to-toe, bring those huge gloves up for protection, and not have to worry about takedowns. All they have to be concerned about is their opponent's left and right hands hitting their body or head. Of course, that's a simplistic explanation, but you get the point. So when it comes to training, practicing, and developing their skills, MMA fighters have a lot more to be concerned about.
I would say that the boxing in boxing is more elite than the boxing in MMA, but the technique-wise, like the amount of stuff you have to gather to be a good mixed martial artist, there's a far, far broader spectrum of what you have to learn to become a successful MMA fighter. So although I agree that the refinement of the boxing is better in boxing, I feel like the broader skill set has to be mixed martial arts.
They have the entirety of jiu-jitsu, offensive and defensive wrestling, Muay Thai, boxing, kickboxing, clinch work, karate, and so much more. And sure, some fighters often excel in one discipline more than others, but nowadays you have to be well-rounded.
Boxers, all they do is box. Mixed martial artists, we do a variety of combat sports, okay? So you can't get as good. We're not specialists, we're good well-rounders.
As the saying goes, most top UFC fighters end up becoming a jack of all trades, but a master of none. They're extremely skilled everywhere, but the vast majority would have no chance of becoming a world champion in an individual martial art. Of course, with the exceptions of fighters who have already come to MMA from a different discipline.
I mean, I feel the guys that's in the UFC couldn't make it in boxing, so they chose the UFC. I mean, they fight for like, what, 12 minutes, tattoo their head, put a couple piercings in their lip, in their ear, whatever, and to go out there and fight for a street fight for 12 minutes.
He couldn't cut it in our sport. I mean, I got 135 pounder, doesn't mean it would drop him on his head. He would make it out of the first round.
Whereas for boxers, they only have one part of MMA to focus on. So after a career of dedication solely to boxing, they're absolute masters when it comes to the sweet science. But despite this, so many MMA fighters have taken the leap to boxing, and more often than not, it's ended horribly. While there's been the odd fighter moving from MMA to boxing, it never really became mainstream until one man changed the combat sports landscape for good: Conor McGregor.
All right, let's get the show started! The reigning, defending, 155-pound champion of the UFC, the notorious Conor McGregor!
When he was able to get a deal signed with the biggest boxer in the world at the time, it changed everything. All of a sudden, if the stars aligned, MMA fighters could move to boxing and try their hand. But ultimately in that fight, McGregor lost convincingly. And while he did win some of the opening rounds, a lot of fight fans believed that Floyd was just being patient and somewhat let Conor get those rounds. Since then, the floodgates have opened for MMA fighters wanting to transition over. Kamaru Usman wanted to fight Canelo Alvarez, Sugar Sean wanted Ryan Garcia, but one person they always call out is Jake Paul.
Look, I'm gonna be real with you. I'm calling out Jake.
You're calling out Jake Paul?
I would love to fight you.
Are you calling out Jake Paul right now?
I mean, if the guy wants to come to MMA, I'll gladly whip his fucking ass.
And say what you want about Jake Paul, but he's been the one to show the world that MMA fighters don't belong in boxing. Ben Askren, Tyron Woodley twice, Anderson Silva, Nate Diaz, and Mike Perry. 6 times UFC vets have tried to beat Jake Paul in boxing, and 6 times they've failed pretty miserably to the point where it's gotten a bit embarrassing.
I got knocked out by Jake Paul. It's fucking embarrassing.
And sure, there are caveats for all of Jake Paul's MMA opponents, like Anderson Silva being older, Ben Askren being a terrible striker, or Mike Perry having a size disadvantage. But perhaps Anderson aside, none of them looked overly comfortable boxing. In fact, there's been very few instances where MMA fighters have fought elite boxers and it's gone according to plan. Anderson beat Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., but Chavez was struggling with drug addiction at the time. Vitor Belfort battered Evander Holyfield, but the legendary heavyweight was almost 60 years old when Vitor was just 44. Arguably, the most successful MMA fighter to move over has been Francis Ngannou. Lots was made of his decision to give up the UFC's heavyweight title and test free agency, but it at least to some degree worked.
Francis just thinks that he's in a position where he's got some Conor McGregor-Mayweather fight on his hands, which he does not. That fight was like a once-in-a-lifetime type deal.
In his first fight against Tyson Fury, who was viewed as the best heavyweight of his era at the time, Ngannou arguably won.
I'm absolutely lost for words. I mean, Francis Ngannou has never boxed before. And fair play to him. I mean, I didn't think he was overly impressive, but Tyson Fury looked like he's never laced up a pair of gloves before. Got dropped in, was it the 3rd round? Never threw a punch. Ngannou never threw a punch after. I thought Ngannou won by 2 rounds.
The naysayers claimed that Fury didn't believe Ngannou would be a threat and hadn't trained hard enough. Although that may be true, it doesn't take away from Ngannou's performance. But in his next boxing match against Anthony Joshua, someone who wouldn't take Ngannou lightly, reality struck.
There was nobody home, right? You see it in the eyes and the face, and there's nobody home. Does it one more time, and Francis is not only out, he is out cold. You could count to 1 or you could count to 100. Fight's over.
It was a devastating knockout, something no one was able to come close to achieving in MMA. But against an elite boxer, it looked like Ngannou had never trained a day in his life. So, if MMA fighters have a proven history of failure, why are they still so eager to do it? The big reason? Money. The top stars in boxing earn so much more than their counterparts in MMA. They can do the same amount of training, the same amount of pre-fight media, sell the same amount of pay-per-views, yet the boxer will walk away with $20, $40, $50 million paydays, while the UFC fighter may get a couple of million.
You have to be really marketable in MMA to make any money, but in boxing you can, I believe. I believe you can, and I think that with these fights that we're having, like Jake Paul, Tyron Woodley, I think it's proven that. We've got MMA fighters at the end of their career going over to boxing to make a bit of money, and the money's there for them to be made. So, we're not seeing that in MMA right now.
For example, Ngannou reportedly made $20 million for his Anthony Joshua fight, which, according to the information online, is 5 times the amount he earned in his entire UFC career. And with Saudi and Turkey Al Sheikh pumping wild amounts of money into boxing, those lucrative fight purses are only getting even larger. While on the other side, unless your name is Conor McGregor, even the biggest draws in the UFC aren't making anywhere close to 8 figures in a single evening. Aside from money, there might just be one other reason UFC fighters keep moving over: delusion. MMA fans, MMA fighters, and everyone involved overestimates how good at striking some fighters are. After all, it wasn't that long ago that even Joe Rogan believed that Ronda Rousey could beat Floyd Mayweather. And while that's an extreme example, people in MMA get carried away.
I could see a world where Ngannou was going to actually go out there and win this fight. I did. I picked Ngannou with my heart, right? I was like, let's do it. I'm all in. Ngannou's going to get the job done. He's going to shock the world. He's going to beat Anthony Joshua. I was stupid. I was fooled, right? I was sold a dream.
It's only been in recent years where fans have accepted that, okay, MMA fighters are nowhere near the level of boxers when it comes to boxing alone. But of course, supreme confidence just comes as a byproduct of being a fighter. So presumably they think they're going to be the exception to the rule and shock the world. But if we're honest, it's really the money. They are prize fighters after all. So even though all the evidence is out there that MMA fighters can succeed in boxing, they're not going to stop trying anytime soon.